Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 4 of National Safe Work Month and today's information webinar, Preventing Musculoskeletal Disorders. Today's session is brought to you by SafeWork SA in collaboration with Return to Work SA. Before we start, there is just a couple of housekeeping notices. So there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the webinar. Please use the Q&A function, which is a button that you see at the top of your screen, if you are planning on asking the panel a question. This is the best place to pose the questions because there's an option for being anonymous if that's what you prefer. We will also have a survey at the end of today's webinar, and we kindly ask that you provide some feedback for the team. You may use the chat function throughout today's webinar. This is a good place to discuss and bounce some ideas around with other participants in the room, but this isn't the place that the panel will be taking questions from. So that's just something to keep in mind. I did mention before that we will record today's session. It will be available on YouTube next week, and that the slide deck itself won't be available, but the recording will be. Firstly, on behalf of our panel, I would like to acknowledge the Kaurna people on whose land we present to you from today, and pay respect to Aboriginal people in attendance. We recognise all First Nations people as traditional owners and occupants of the land and waters from all the nations of this great country. Further, we acknowledge their cultural and heritage beliefs, languages and laws, which are of ongoing importance. We acknowledge that Aboriginal people have endured past injustice and dispossession of their traditional lands and waters. So it's with great pride that I can introduce today's panel to you. We have with us today Heidi Turbill, Team Leader of the Work Environment Unit, and Heidi is a certified professional ergonomist and registered occupational therapist. So looking forward to having you here today. Thanks, Heidi.
Thanks, David.
Haroun holds a PhD in the field of ergonomics and is the Principal Inspector of Ergonomics at SafeWork SA. Thank you for being with us today, Haroun.
Thanks, David.
And Anaf is a qualified physiotherapist who works as an injury risk consultant at Return to Work SA and has provided us with some excellent statistics. So thank you very much for being here, Alex.
Pleasure, David. Nice to be here.
And my name's David Knight. I'm an education and engagement advisor here at SafeWork, and I'll be your host. So what's going to be covered today? There's plenty to get through, and I know time is precious, so we'll push right ahead. We're going to look at some basics, clear definitions. We really want to look at the injury prevalence and claims data, and thank you very much, Alex, for providing that. We're going to look at some of the links between psychosocial hazards and musculoskeletal disorders. We'll look at regulations, so WHS obligations and regulations and what employers need to be mindful of. We will be announcing some of the campaign details as part of today's webinar and some future training opportunities, and mentioning to you and promoting to you our advisory services, which are available as part of this campaign as well. So what brings us here? I have something of a provocation for you all, and the question is, have we forgotten about musculoskeletal disorders? It seems like such a well-known topic, and we all know that people get injured at work. So the question has to be then, what can we be doing better to prevent it? Do we have risk management fatigue when it comes to hazardous manual tasks, or are we not understanding and identifying them sufficiently to manage the risk? Today's webinar will look at some of the fundamentals as well as some contemporary understanding of hazardous manual tasks and musculoskeletal disorders. It's going to give you some insights from the regulator and other risk management professionals to point you in the direction of solutions that, to this persistent issue in workplace injury. So just very briefly, what are musculoskeletal disorders? Well, this is a term that includes a range of common injuries that might be classified as otherwise sprains and strains, but could also cover everything from tennis elbow and nerve injuries like carpal tunnel syndrome to ruptured lumbar discs, meniscal tears of the knees or rotator cuff injuries, in your shoulder. So most commonly, these injuries gradually develop over time, but they can also occur as a result of a single event. And you might hear about people who, even in a normal workplace, they say they were just bending over to pick up a pen and their back went, or they wake up after a hard day's work and they feel they can't move. So all of these we would classify as musculoskeletal disorders. But to understand the mechanics and the physiology of how they occur, let's hear from an expert, Heidi, team leader of Work Environment Team, who is a professional ergonomist. What can you tell us about musculoskeletal disorders and the mechanism by which they occur, Heidi?
Thanks, David. Yeah, so what we know about musculoskeletal disorders is that the musculoskeletal tissue itself has a certain degree of strength or tolerance to which it can handle the amount of load or work which it's been asked to perform. And these three diagrams here sort of help talk through that concept. So you can see the little red line there representing that tissue tolerance that we use as a term. So what we know over the course of a day is that our muscles and ligaments and joints, etc., are required to do some work and are subjected to this load. And over a period of time, I suppose fatigue can settle in, and it actually reduces the tissue's tolerance to withstand that load or force that's being applied to it. But after a period of rest or recovery or break from doing that particular movement or the application of force, the tissue has an ability to recover from that, and the tissue tolerance increases again to a point where it's ready to go back to work. So we see just that natural fluctuation over a day or over a week or longer period of time, where we can go through periods of feeling a bit more fatigued and the tissue then being able to recover. However, in situations where we have the continued exposure to that application of force or load being placed on that tissue, we see that the tissue tolerance can continue to decrease over a period of time to a point where it can no longer withstand it and it results in injury. So that's what the second diagram really draws on there. And then in the last diagram, we have that more, as David was mentioning, more that one-off incident where the amount of force or pressure that's placed on that tissue is really breached and it's too excessive, and the tissue itself is damaged and results in an actual injury itself. So if we move on to a little bit more deeper discussion in this area, we know that there are also some other factors that impact musculoskeletal disorder risk. And over a long period of time, where we've had a lot of research over the last couple of decades really in this space, we realise that there's actually both physical and psychosocial stresses which impact on tissue health. So looking at this diagram, over on the left-hand side, we could have aspects of the way that the work area is laid out or designed, which could result in someone needing to reach further or reach higher, or maybe have to travel or transport things over a longer distance within a work area. We could have the number of things that needed to be handled, or the number of actions or movements that were required that would have an influence both on the physical aspects of the work. And then we have those other aspects of the environmental conditions. So it could have to do with the lighting or the heating or cooling or where the work is performed. It also might have a very physical aspect on the body. And then lastly, it's more what we know in terms of the system, in terms of the way that the work is designed, and we work in that system that can have maybe more those psychosocial elements or stresses that are present as well. So all of those factors really create a scenario where we're either looking at a certain degree of mechanical load that is placed on those tissues, so a certain amount of strain or stretch on tendons or ligaments, or the actual amount of force that's applied to a muscle or a musculoskeletal disc. But then the other causal pathway really relates to the stress response that we feel in our bodies when we feel like we're overworked. And in that situation, we have certain chemicals or hormones that are released into our body, And though the presence of those hormones themselves can actually impact on the musculoskeletal tissue. So in that way, as we can see, we've got listed there, we could see that at a very microscopic level, there could be reduced blood flow going to certain tissue to keep it healthy. We can see a reduced capacity for a tissue that might be just starting to show some signs of a bit of tear or damage, an inability for it to heal itself well. We could see some localized swelling and also tendon inflammation, for example. So really, it's both that physical, the aspect of the mechanical load and this stress response in the body that's really impacting on, I suppose, the resilience of the musculoskeletal tissue to handle that load, which ultimately results in cumulative tissue damage, pain, and musculoskeletal injury.
Yeah, it's certainly a really interesting take that I don't think everyone, or it certainly wouldn't come as an obvious thing to most people, that there's a stress response which has a chemical, causes chemical changes which can actually weaken, make tissue tolerance, reduction. That's a really interesting sort of factor. Thank you for sharing that, and I know we'll be speaking to you again soon, so don't go too far away. Alex, I'm going to call on you now to talk about some of the statistics with MSDs, and it's interesting to understand. We've looked at the theory of how they're occurring. What can you tell us about the data here?
Yeah, thank you, David. Look, we can break this down in a number of ways, and what I guess I wanted to start with and share with everybody is a little bit of history around the last 5 or 6 years in South Australia around what type of claims are we seeing and what's the prevalence of this within our state. And what we can see from the bar graph there is that body stressing claims, which are traditionally your manual handling type injuries, are by far and away the most frequent event that's claimed for here, with about 35% of all claims lodged being for that mechanism of injury. And we can also have a look and see that slips, trips and fall type injuries and also being hit by a moving object both account for around 20% of the claims lodged in SA. And those two categories typically result in a musculoskeletal disorder. So by far and away from a prevalence point of view, musculoskeletal disorders are what we see the most of here in SA. And we can look at this another way and put some numbers on this in a little bit more detail. And what we see is that around about 6,500 to 7,000 claims each year approximately are for musculoskeletal disorders. And I guess the bit that jumps out here to me is that that's remained pretty static over the last 5 or so years. We haven't seen a great reduction over time, which I guess as a physio, I'd be hoping to see that we're getting on top of this and reducing this over time, but the numbers are staying pretty static here.
Yeah, they are. And even just looking and thinking about the previous graph that you showed, I know SafeWork Australia data, speaks to the cost of mental stress, and it's been well documented, and people do like to talk about the fact that, the knock-on effect of psychosocial injury or, psychological injury at work causing long-term absence and costing a lot of money. But clearly body stressing and musculoskeletal disorders are outweighing by sheer number.
Yeah, that's right. It's the prevalence that I think becomes a factor here. If I can get my light to work. There we go. Yeah, the prevalence is scary. I mean, every injury belongs to an individual, and that's a lot of individuals suffering there. So I think it's poignant to be trying to get on top of it. Looking at it in a little bit more detail, we can look at mechanism, and I find this one fascinating. What we see here, again, over that same time frame, over the last 5 or so years, that about 38% of all the musculoskeletal or body stressing claims that we've received, 38% of those are for tasks that involve some sort of lifting, carrying, pushing or pulling type mechanism, which I think is probably what we more traditionally associate with body stressing injuries and musculoskeletal disorders, something with probably a bit of force attached to it. But looking a little bit more closely, we can see about 35%, so a very similar number of these claims actually come from tasks where either no object is being handled or it's a repetitive type movement that's caused the injury with a very low level of force or loading attached to it. So as much as we think about force and effort resulting in musculoskeletal disorders, equally we see it for tasks that are, you could probably term as being quite light. So I think it shows we need to be thinking a little bit more broadly about what's contributing to these injuries if we want to get a better handle on them.
Mm. Yeah, thanks, Alex. Another one for you here.
Yeah, age profile. So what we see over working age and the age profile of claimants is this slight step increase. As age increases, the number of claims we receive for these disorders increases as well. But I think we have to take this with a grain of salt. I think without really clear data on the headcount of people working in these age brackets, it's hard to know whether one age group is over or underrepresented here. So for me, the bit that I take away from this is that it's affecting everyone. There's not an age group where you can say, you're immune to this type of problem. You don't need to worry too much. So I think it's something that's affecting everyone.
Yeah, thank you. What about by gender?
Yeah, again, the common theme to this data, I think, is how steady it's been over the years. And what we see looking at it from a gender breakdown is pretty consistently there's more claims for males than females by about 2/3 to 1/3. And that's remained pretty static over the past 5 or so years. And I think historically, sometimes we think that, perhaps men will take on some of the more difficult roles in an organisation because they're maybe seen as being fitter or stronger or some other stereotype like that. But actually, that's where we see 2/3 of the claims coming from. So again, this is relevant to everybody.
And the best for last, because I know that lots of people here today are probably thinking, what about my industry? What about
me?
What about my area? How do we rank? What can you tell us about this? I found this graph quite interesting. I didn't expect to, I sort of a little bit expected healthcare to be up there as well, but I was a little bit surprised.
Yeah, look, there's lots of ways you can read this, and I agree. I think it helps us to hone in on the patch that we perhaps work in. But what we see here is that healthcare and social assistance as an industry group do account for the highest number of musculoskeletal claims in South Australia, with about 21% of all those claims coming from that industry, followed by manufacturing and then construction industry. And again, that's remained pretty stable. There are some factors that maybe are impacting on that, but it's a pattern that we've seen throughout South Australia for a number of years now.
Yeah, and so taking into account all of this data, there is a lot to unpack there. But if you could sort of leave us with a few key takeaways, what do you think they would be?
Good question. I think the bit I take away from this is that as strong as the numbers can be, they're really only the tip of the iceberg here. So we know that there's a lot of people out there that may have some sort of injury or ailment, but aren't claiming for it. So they might be on an early intervention program through their employer. They may just be self-managing it like a lot of people do, or there may be just some hesitancy to, report the injury in the first place. So we would never have visibility on that. So our numbers really are tip of the iceberg, which I think can be a little bit scary. And I think the other part to it, we can get carried away with the numbers and trying to put objective sort of findings around it. But the human cost and the human side of these injuries, every injury is going to belong to an individual, but there's a really large ripple effect that goes on with that. The impact on their family, the impact on their co-workers, both directly and indirectly, the impact on their employer. So it could be a loss of productivity, it could be increased premiums that they have to pay to tackle this. And even then at a society level, there can be a drain on healthcare resources to be managing these types of injuries. So I think it's a really far-reaching range of issues that these problems create.
Alex, we haven't really discussed this before, so you're going to probably look at me and say, why are you bringing it up now? But as a society, are we people who we work with ailments? You know, we continue to work past the point where we say, actually, I'm a bit sore today, you know, or my back's not feeling great, or, you know, my arm's sore, but we just get up and go to work. Is that in your experience, as you know, in your role, do you feel that's part of our culture as we sort of push through?
Yeah, certainly that can be a case. And I think that will be different for every individual, but I think there's certainly, you could say that to an extent. And I think there's an interesting point within that around where does some sort of musculoskeletal disorder or change, where does that transition to becoming an injury? So plenty of people will have, you know, stiffness in a joint or tight muscles or aches and pains, but don't necessarily associate that with being injured. So I think there's a way we need to be thinking about what actually makes someone feel like they're injured, to the point of then putting their hand up and seeking help, as opposed to it being something that they just see as normal day-to-day stuff.
Yeah, that's right, because, you know, it might be a niggle, and you shouldn't have to be fully incapacitated before you acknowledge that it's a bit of an injury. Yeah,
that's right. And you can have some sort of physical limitation, but it doesn't mean that there's an activity restriction attached to that, or a participation restriction. So it's that continuum that I think we need to look at.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, and also stick around, because I believe we'll have some questions for you later.
Happy to.
So we've talked about musculoskeletal disorders. Let's take a look at the type of work which could lead to one. So they're known as hazardous manual tasks. There's a code of practice around this. But essentially, a hazardous manual task is defined as a task that requires a person to lift, lower, push, pull, carry, or otherwise move, hold, or restrain any person, animal, or thing that involves one or more of the following: repetitive or sustained force, high or sudden force, repetitive movement, sustained and or awkward posture, or vibration. So I'm sure many people that are tuned in are familiar with the code of practice and what is a hazardous manual task. And it feels like there are lots of things we do at work which could be classified as hazardous manual tasks. So I'm going to ask you, Heidi, if you can sort of talk us through the obligations from a WHS point of view around hazardous manual tasks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. So in the Work Health Safety Regulations, there's Regulation 60, which specifically looks at hazardous manual tasks, and it talks that a person conducting a business or undertaking must manage the risks to health and safety relating to MSDs that are associated with hazardous manual tasks, and it specifically refers duty holders back to the general duties in 3 Part 1, which talks about the need to, first of all, identify the hazards, look at managing the hazard and using, specifically going through the hierarchy of control, and then looking at the maintenance and review of those control measures. Throughout all of that process, obviously, there is also the duty to consult with workers, both to identify the hazards and to implement the control measures themselves. So if we move on to dive into that a little bit further, Regulation 60 Part 2 specifically talks about the control measures which must be used to manage those risks. And so what it states is that business owners must give regard to the postures and movements, the forces that an individual must undertake, and the exposure to vibration. We need to look at the duration and maybe the magnitude to which workers are needing to perform those postures and movements, the frequency at which they're performing them as well. And then with all of that, look at the overlay of that work environment, the design and layout of the work, the tools and equipment which are being used, and also those systems of work. So I think, control measures need to be targeted at making changes to those elements. Now, the really important point I think that's needs to be discussed here is that training individuals in changing their behaviour, in how they do their work, is not addressing any of those factors. And we see that, quite often after an injury has occurred, that maybe an incident investigation might follow. And quite often the findings in that incident investigation is the person used poor manual handling techniques and they've been sent to have training. And, really what is at stake here is the fact that the tasks themselves were likely to be hazardous themselves, and it is in fact those that need to change, not the worker's behaviour.
Mm.
So the other regulation that relates to hazardous manual tasks is the duties of designers, manufacturers, importers and suppliers of plant and structures. So these people could be architects, engineers, fabricators, or really anybody that makes a decision that influences the design of plant and structures. So the duty holders need to, or they must eliminate or minimise the need for a hazardous manual task to be carried out. And also the people who are creating that design, they need to give the people who are in effect giving effect to the design or building the structure or the piece of plant adequate information so that they understand the features of the design that minimise the need for those hazardous manual tasks. So if you're, for example, getting an architect in to redesign a particular workspace at your premises, they would have a duty to try to look at design the areas so that they were free of risk in looking at considering things like bench heights, having adequate workspace to use mechanical plant or equipment. They might look at the floor surfaces or the lighting and ensure that different pieces of equipment can be ruled around easily in that area. If you're designing a piece of equipment or a piece of plant, we might want to consider how much it weighs, the dimensions on it, maybe the handles that might be used, and also the interfaces of the design in using to operate the piece of equipment. And lastly, also considering things like ease of access to perform maintenance on the equipment as well. So the duty of designers is an area of increased focus in the future for us here at SafeWork SA. So I would like to draw attention to that in general.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. I'm sure from a regulation perspective, or from a regulator's perspective, it is a difficult thing to have line of sight onto so many different pieces of plant that are being manufactured all across the world. It's great to hear. Great to hear that it will have a new or renewed focus. Just going to get your thoughts on what inspectors are seeing, and Haroun, you can jump in here anytime as well if you feel there's anything to add. But Heidi, I suppose, as the team leader, what are inspectors seeing out in the field?
We certainly do see businesses tackling hazardous manual tasks and putting into place, effective control measures to manage those risks. However, I suppose we do see some fairly broad themes which are commonplace as well. So I thought I'd take the time to highlight those. I suppose, initially, sometimes we'll certainly see just that failure to actually identify hazardous manual task hazards in the first place. And that obviously has the flow-on effect that there's a lack of risk assessment that's actually being performed. So that, that's one thing. Then we have some situations where the risk assessments might be undertaken, but they're done in a way that's not really looking to identify what the true source of the risk or the hazard is. So we see people quite often jumping sort of straight to the control measure, and they're putting control measures in place which are manual handling training only. And saying, oh, well, if we give people training, then we're managing the risk. Or there might be a situation where they're just relying on team lifting if there's like a heavy piece of equipment or item that needs to be handled. And we know that these control measures just aren't effective in really managing the risk. They're still exposing workers to significant risk of injury. So looking at specifically that training element, probably what's most concerning, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, is I suppose there's an overly reliant focus on what we would call how to lift training, or training which is solely focused on the technique that workers use to undertake the work. And we would I'm sure we've all seen the posters up around in a work site around, don't bend your back, lift with your knees, keep your back straight, or, keep the load close to you. So we just, really want to say that these aren't, effective control measures. And also the idea of just having like a short little induction video or something that just features giving some very broad general principles, that isn't effective either. There need to be some control measures in place. Probably the last point I just really want to talk about is that consultation piece with your workers. I suppose, we might see that across business, they might have trialled a piece of equipment, let's say, they might have bought a piece of equipment thinking that they've put the right control measure in place, and then they're finding, a month down the track, the piece of equipment sitting in the corner, it's not being used, and the workers are just saying, look, it's just not fit for purpose, it doesn't help us, it's too cumbersome or too difficult to handle. And just through that lack of initial consultation, taking a little bit more time to work out what's the best solution, they could have spent their money wisely and actually purchased something that, is really going to make a difference. Another sort of scenario is perhaps looking at, in a different sort of field, is looking at maybe IT software or different programs that we use at computer workstations. And sometimes we see when these are introduced, we'll notice that people need to double the amount of mouse clicks or other kind of functions in order to complete a workflow, which ultimately increases the repetitive workload or the workload in general on staff to complete that same amount of work, and increases, I suppose, a lot of frustration on the workers as well, because it's just taking longer to complete the task, even though that might have the same expectation of work output. So those types of scenarios really do increase the risk of, repetitive strain injuries. And once again, it just comes back to that aspect of good consultation through the decision-making process initially would help to identify those things, and you've got an ability to design them out before they come as an issue.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. Alex or Haroun, Alex, what do you see commonly in industry?
Yeah, thanks, David. And I guess the work I do with employers, we're looking at injury prevention activities, but also through to injury management. And I think really a lot of the same themes emerge that Heidi's mentioned. So lots of good stuff happening, but what we'll see, again, broadly speaking, is perhaps there's not a robust system in place to tackle these problems. So there'll be components of a system there, but some gaps present. And that might be why some of the hazards are not being identified, or the evaluation of what's been put in place isn't happening effectively. So some gaps crop up there. And I think sometimes just a bit of a mismatch between the solution that's put in place and what the actual hazard was in the first place. So the closer you can match those two things, the more effective the solution is going to be. But the big one, like Heidi's mentioned, I think, is consultation. And that can be done really well at times, but sometimes it's only done at one step of this cycle. So it might be done, when something's being rolled out, for example, or once something's been rolled out, there'll be some consultation, but really trying to bring that into every stage of the process. And there's some pretty cool research around, people taking more ownership of solutions if they've been involved in the creation of them too. So I think it's a really powerful thing for people to be doing. And the other one that I think, we're seeing a bit with our work with industry is probably more at a society level. I think there's a couple of things going on that might be impacting on this. So Number one, we've got pretty low unemployment in the state at the moment. And what I'm hearing from companies is that because of that, they're really struggling to find people to fill jobs and to fill roles. So that's tending to potentially lead to a bit of a mismatch between the people that are being hired to do the work and whether they actually have the capacity to undertake the inherent requirements of the role that they're being hired to do. So I think that's a challenge that we're facing at the moment. And secondly, I think, there's lots of talk out there around cost of living pressures and so on. And what our data is showing is that it looks like people are working more. So that can be people taking on extra shifts, working more overtime, taking on a second or a third job. And all of those things can really increase people's risk of sustaining an injury, whether it's purely through increased exposure to occupation or whether it's leading to things like fatigue, which we heard earlier on from Heidi can result in, more of a risk for a musculoskeletal disorder developing. So, yeah, some wide-ranging things that I think are out there in this space.
Yeah, some very interesting social factors that probably aren't being considered as broadly. So thank you for bringing those to the table. That's very interesting. Thank you, Alex. Moving along, we've got a clearer picture, I suppose, at this point in the webinar of how we got here and what the statistics are telling us and what inspectors are seeing and risk management professionals. So what is SafeWork SA and Return to Work SA have up their sleeve to tackle the problem? And I think Heidi's going to talk to us a little bit about what the campaign has in store. Thanks, Heidi.
Thanks, David. Yeah. So we have had, I suppose, a renewed focus here at SafeWork SA on that, and we're excited to launch our new campaign, which has involved redesigning some tools and resources on our website, which are available now. We're also going to be looking at some how-to workshops, really looking at how we go about risk management for hazardous manual tasks, which will be commencing in November. So we'll give you some links how to register for those. We also have, as David mentioned before, a focus on giving you some free advisory services that are jointly run between Return to Work SA and SafeWork SA as well. And lastly, next week, I would encourage many of you, and I can see in the chat, there's quite a few comments coming through about manual handling training and technique training. Next week, we specifically have a webinar on the role of manual handling training in preventing MSD. So I would encourage you to enrol for that if you're interested in that space.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Heidi. For everyone watching along, we will provide the QR code links again for the two or for the upcoming events as we go a little bit further along. As far as the new resources and tools, I'd invite Haroun now to talk to us about those. There's some excellent new resources. What can you tell us about those?
Sure. Thanks, David. Yeah. It's interesting to hear about all different challenges and given the data that we have. And we are excited actually that we recently in the last few months, we have significantly expanded the content on hazardous manual tasks on SafeWork SA website. And we went actually through a thorough review of existing resources and guidelines from all the regulators or industry best practices. We reviewed some research and evidence-based tools to come up with this content on SafeWork SA website. So as you have seen in the screen, we have the landing page and we divided the content in different sections. We provided some understanding around MSDs. What are they? What are the risk factors? What would lead to MSDs at work? We specified some sections around duty holders, the requirements for duty holders in workplace when it comes to hazardous manual tasks. We have a specific section actually where we guide and we provide some comprehensive guidance on step-by-step on how to manage hazardous manual tasks in workplace. We set some guidance around the training requirement. There was a lot of mentioning about how to lift training. We have some guidance on what's an adequate and suitable training in workplaces is. And we have a series of guidance materials as well in there. So the aim of this content is to actually help PCBUs and businesses to better understand and provide practical guidance to support managing hazardous manual tasks. And as part of that, there is a series of resources and tools that we have developed. So there is within the resources tab in there. So we will find different tools that we developed for different purposes that will guide you through the risk management process of hazardous manual tasks. You will find a series of guidance materials that assist you as well when addressing hazardous manual tasks in workplace. You can see on the right screen how they are presented and each tool, the name of each tool, and we provide some brief description on how that tool could be used, and it could be downloaded as well, and you can start using it straight away. I will walk you through some of the tools briefly now.
Thank you, Haroun. That would be great.
Yep. All right, so the first tool that I want to bring to your attention, as Heidi mentioned earlier on, and Alex agreed on that, is there is some challenges in workplaces, or workplaces don't have any systems in place to actually identify hazardous manual tasks, or they are poorly identified, or they are not identified at all. So here it comes handy with the identification tool. It actually provides you some guidance on the different steps when you are looking at hazardous manual tasks, what you need to look at, and how to keep records of these hazardous manual tasks in your workplace. For instance, you need to report in every manual task, for example, what is the risk factors present in terms of force? Is it posture? Is it vibration? Is it movement? And you need as well to look and report if workers are reporting any discomforts or pain from that work, if it is physically demanding. You need to look at your workplace injuries and incidents that might occur from that task. And you look as well in any ongoing claims that are compensation claims that are coming from that tasks. And at the end, that last column is actually to prompt you to look at any controls you have in place. And if those controls you have in place are ineffective, or for example, workers are still complaining or they're still suffering pain, means that task is actually likely need the risk assessment and you need to implement proper controls. So the tool, in a nutshell, the tool provides you with this guidance on how to identify hazardous manual tasks in your workplace, as well how to record and keep records and proactively update that identification tool in your workplace.
Perfect, thank you. Leads nicely into this one too, like this one.
Excellent, yeah, absolutely. So earlier on, it was mentioned earlier on about an emphasis around the consultation. And this is as a legal obligation as well. As a PCB, you have a legal obligation to consult with your workers. And the discomfort survey is an excellent tool to start that conversation with workers and engage them to identify tasks that are hazardous. So what the tool does is actually just a 2-page tool that you can distribute to staff and ask the staff if they are suffering from any pain or discomforts from the task that they are doing on a daily basis. And if there are any tasks that are actually physically demanding or fatiguing for workers. And the tool as well has an section where you ask workers on what adjustment actually they could suggest to improve that task. So you're actually thinking forward about possible controls and how you can change those tasks to prevent the injuries in first place. It's an excellent tool for starting that conversation with workers, engaging workers, and engaging that piece of consulting with workers.
Yeah, looks excellent. Thanks, Haroun.
Yep.
What about this one?
Thanks, David. So that's another tool as well. So after you have identified hazardous manual tasks in workplace and you started that risk assessment process, we have for you the risk assessment and control tool. And this is a unique tool that we use it, and we try to deviate a bit differently from what's been used before. So we try to design this rating scale for each risk factor. And what we have noticed before from businesses or in practices, what happens, and some existing materials, is that risk might not be fully captured when you are doing that risk assessment. Due to there is some strict interpretation of some guidance materials that happen. For example, what is repetitive, what is sustained when you are looking at assessing that risk. The guidance, for example, some guidance that are available in current code of practice, it defines, for example, a movement that is repetitive, that it happens every 30 seconds. But this is only as a guidelines. And what we have seen in workplaces is they are restrictedly interpreting that definition and assessing if there is a risk of movement or not. For example, if the movement is happening every 40 seconds or 50 seconds,
they've got the stopwatch.
Yeah, they classify it as there is no risk, which might not be the case if you are using a different sophisticated tools to assess that risk. So the new feature that we included in this risk assessment actually is we derived it from validated tools, and it helps to give some indication in which risk factor is present or not, and to what extent is present in the workplace. And as general guidance, if the risk is within that orange to red zone, means there is a risk of MSTs and it needs to be controlled. Or the more combination of risk factors that are present means there is a greater risk of MSTs in the workplace and it has to be controlled. On the right side, so the second part within this tool is actually prompt you to look at what causes that risk to be present in the first instance. It looks at the sources of the risk. It looks at the work area design and layout. Is it the nature and size of things that they are handled in the workplace? Is it the system of work? Is it the work environment? Heidi went a bit in details with that, but we mentioned early on, for example, around psychosocial hazards in the workplace. If you are finding, for example, is it job demands at work? Is it something that you can fit within the systems of work, as an example? The guide as well, after that, the guide as well guides you through defining some controls. What are the controls in the workplace and how to maintain those controls in the workplace.
Looks great. These tools, will we be able to get a closer look at them? I know you mentioned to me once about the workshops. Will we be bringing these out in the workshops that people can register for?
Absolutely, absolutely. So we are doing the workshops. During the workshops, we'll be guiding you through using these tools, how to use them. We'll try to get some case studies. Yeah, we'll keep it a bit later. We'll go through the workshops on what we'll be doing through the workshops, provide more guidance in terms of how to use these tools.
Fantastic.
So another exciting tools as well, which I find it really, really useful tool for workplaces if they want to see or determine how effective their systems are when around managing hazardous manual tasks. If they want to identify if they have any gaps, if they have any opportunities for improvement of their system when managing hazardous manual tasks. So this is the tool for you. So the tool actually guides you through different sections, including your management commitment at workplace around hazardous manual tasks. What's your consultation process in workplace? What's your risk management process around hazardous manual tasks? How investigations happens when an injury is reported or musculoskeletal injury is reported at the workplace. What are your practices and processes around training and supervision and how hazardous manual tasks are reported? So what the system does, it has a checklist in there, it has a different elements. And once you complete the tool, you will have a feel where your organization is sitting. If you are within the green zone, means you are doing really good practice and you likely have some effective hazard HMT management system in place. If you are within the orange or yellow zone, that zone means there are opportunities for improvement. But you are working towards that systematic approach. But if you are within the red zone, is likely your system is ineffective in addressing hazardous manual tasks, and you must do something to improve your systems to manage hazardous manual tasks effectively. So the tool in itself, in summary, just gives you some indications on how your workplace is progressing when it comes to managing hazardous manual tasks.
Right. Thank you. And finally, a couple of other tools or links on the site.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are more sophisticated tools and advanced tools that the workplace or business can implement in the workplace. An example is the firm toolkit. So the firm toolkit probably is the unique tool in Australia that addresses both the physical and psychosocial hazards when it comes to preventing musculoskeletal injuries. There is the Perform program. The Perform program is based on participative ergonomics with internationally recommended approach when it comes to preventing MSTs. It just relies on that, provides that framework to help engage workers from different levels in the workplace through all that process of managing the risk, from identifying to assessing to coming up with controls of that hazardous manual task in the workplace. And then we have the mantra as well, which is task specific for risk assessment. So it assesses the risk, and the unique with it is it looks at the different body parts and how that is impacting the different body parts. And it uses some scoring system. And at the end, it gives you some total score that indicates if there is a risk of MSDs or not. So there is some guidance materials when it comes to these tools on our website as well.
Fantastic. Looks really great, Haroun. And I'm sure lots of people are looking forward to getting on the website and downloading some free resources for sure.
Thanks, David. Yep.
Heidi, here's the I guess information about what's coming up, what's happening next. What are we doing next here at SafeWork and Return to Work?
Yeah, that's right. So just as I mentioned before, we are going to be running another webinar next week, specifically about the role of manual handling training in preventing musculoskeletal disorders. So next Wednesday from 10 to 11, that's a QR code, and you can find the registration links on our website as well. So if you're using manual handling training in your organisation, or maybe you're a provider of manual handling training, would really recommend that you come along and attend this session, which will be recorded as well and made available on our YouTube stream. We'll be covering aspects about some of the myths about manual handling training that we've noticed in industry. We'll be covering over a little bit more about the research and the evidence that exists on what we call sort of how to lift or technique-based training interventions. And we'll be specifically talking about our regulators' viewpoint on what type of training is considered suitable and adequate in looking at hazardous manual task risk management. So noting some of the comments in the chat
Yes.
that have been coming through, I would really encourage you to come along to that session.
I agree. I think that there's been a lot of comments in the chat, which I've just looked at around training, and it seems like everyone's got some experience in that area, whether they've been trained or they do training or they provide training for staff. We've all seen it, we've all been there, and yet the injuries still occur. So it's great to, I'm very keen to get stuck into the role of training in preventing MSDs and perhaps some of the misconceptions. So that'll be interesting.
So then following on from then and kicking off in November, we're going to be running a series of online workshops. So these workshops are going to be a bit longer in duration. They'll probably go for about 2.5 hours. And we're going to be going through just step by step how to go through that risk management process. We'll be using the tools that Haroun has just spoken about, and we're going to be working through some case studies so you can actually get some real life experience in how you would apply the tools in particular work scenarios. So they'll be starting off in November. The first one's going to be on Wednesday, the 20th, but there'll be other monthly run workshops that you can sign up to if you can't attend the one coming up in November. We will be taking a break over the Christmas New Year period, so the next one will be in February, but you can see some of the initial dates available on our website.
Perfect. Thanks, Heidi. And thanks to Beck, who is posting links to the webinar and to the online workshops in the chat as we speak. This is just an excellent opportunity for me to spruik our advisory services as an advisor at SafeWork. If you are managing a small to medium business, you can request an advisor to visit your workplace. They can work with you to check over your current systems, layout, WHS practices to determine if you can make any improvements. A WHS advisor will provide you with a visit report. Alternatively, you might choose to have an education or an engagement advisor come out to discuss and help you understand employer obligations and work health and safety law. You can contact us using the website or the number on your screen. And also, just by way of sort of keeping you in the loop and aware, you could email the work environment unit with technical questions about ergonomics or hazardous manual tasks directly at AGD SWSA work environment at sa.gov.au. That brings us to the end of our formal part of the information session, and we'll invite some questions from the Q&A panel. We'll see what we've got waiting for us here. If you are thinking of a question as we speak, please head over to the Q&A function button at the top. There's a question here from Christopher asking, has a designer ever been prosecuted following a hazardous manual task injury? So in other words, the designer themselves been found at fault and taken the brunt of it?
Yeah, look, happy to answer that question. There certainly have been a few designers that have been prosecuted. Not many, I will grant, but across the country, there certainly have been a few prosecutions that have been laid. And as you mentioned before, it will be, I suppose, an area of increased focus that we are going to be looking at in terms of looking at designers upholding their duties there. So would be keen for those working in that space to be given a little bit better consideration to how they're engaging and consulting in that area. Just noticing the other question from Chris that you posed there about tissue tolerance that I talked to earlier in the session. You've just made a comment there to say, would tissue tolerance not also be hugely varied in individuals due to their body type, strength, flexibility, etc.? Absolutely, people's individual strengths and so on does vary, and we expect that across a population. But as Alex spoke to earlier, even where we see men still having, considerably more injuries than women, it still comes back to the point of designing work which can accommodate and is as suitable as possible for the widest range of people to do the tasks. So whether you're stronger or weaker or more flexible, there still is an overriding duty to design good work. So yeah, that would be interesting. If there's any other questions, please let us know.
There was a comment question in the chat around distribution centres and the speed and pace they work at. Inevitably they're trying to hit targets to move product out of these distribution centres as quickly as possible. And the question specifically says the drive to rank among top performers can actually push employees to prioritise speed over safety. And additionally, a culture that views injuries as inevitable to meet the goals could perpetuate unsafe conditions. And how could somebody overcome this issue?
Yeah, what I would say to that practice, rewarding top performers with financial bonuses, that would be, I suppose, a practice that we would discourage, as it does lead to faster pace of work and increased risk of injury. So they would be things that we would consider wanting to review information on should an inspector attend your work site and be asking questions around that. So appreciate there is a complexity in trying to meet production requirements, but at the end of the day, if people are still continuing to get injured, it would assume that your control measures in place aren't effective.
Just heading back to the Q&A now. There's been a little bit of crossover in questions. We've got time for one or two more. If anyone still listening does have a question, head to the Q&A function. At this stage, the question here, there's been a question about AI and has it been identified to play a role in identifying risks, ergonomic risks in musculoskeletal disorders?
Does anybody, sorry, do you want to, I'm just trying to read that question.
Oh, sorry, I'll read it again. Yeah, has AI, artificial intelligence, been identified as being able to play a role in identifying risks, ergonomics and musculoskeletal disorders? Haroun, are you aware of any papers or any other literature on the topic?
Well, yeah, is quite an emerging field that comes up, and there is still a lot of research evidence that still comes up, but there is no clear evidence that it's used or to prevent MSTs at this stage. From research evidence, there is a lot of this field that's evolving rapidly, and yeah, there are a lot of workplaces that started implementing some things, but in clear cut or in summary, there is no clear evidence from that I'm aware of in terms of its effectiveness in preventing MSTs. But definitely is an area of evolvement, and yeah, researchers keep going in this area.
Yeah. Thanks, Haroun. Look, I've looked through the Q&A, and it seems we must have covered a lot because the questions have dried up, and that may be a good thing. We've just about hit our timeline anyway. Thank you all for joining us today and for your participation. We hope you found the information useful, and then you can take something away from today and back to your workplace. A special thank you to all of our panel members, Alex and Anaf from Return to Work SA, Heidi and Haroun from our work environment team. We appreciate all of your input. Remember to register for next week's webinar on the role of training in manual handling, and the workshops which will be commencing in November. There was a question in the chat around whether the workshop itself was a series of workshops or the same workshop delivered multiple times. So I'll clear that up now and tell you it's the same workshop delivered multiple times. So you can sign up at a time that suits you. Just on the screen right now is a QR code for a survey. We would love your feedback on today's session, and perhaps any questions that or comments that you can send to us. We would be more than happy to take them on board. So thank you all for your participation today. Thank you to the panel, and hopefully we'll see you next week.